Good morning, everybody. And I'm going to talk you through today the second lesson in the safeguarding unit. This lesson is a bit of a grim one, really. It's the one which is all about the different sorts of child abuse. So I hope you've had a good breakfast. It's a difficult topic, but it's one of the most important ones we do. When you're working really closely one-to-one with children or with small groups of children, you're going to be in the prime position to be spotting things, taking notice of things which are different, physically looking for signs. And it's quite important that you are able to really kind of zone in and look at the sorts of things you can see and start to build a picture. And if you have concerns, obviously, then things can start to happen to change things around. There are lots of different sorts of abuse, and so what this first talk is going to be about is the different sorts, how to spot them, what the signs are, and then our second talk this morning will be about what to do if you've got concerns about colleagues at work who aren't complying with the legislation or are abusing themselves. Okay, so if you open up your PowerPoint, interesting eye-catching front page. It's actually quite difficult googling pictures for this kind of thing. You just can see all sorts of horrid stuff, but anyway, managed to stay off anything too unpleasant. Our second slide, what is abuse? So a good place to start is the definition. Abuse is when something happens to a child that breaches their human rights and affects their health and development. That's a really wide umbrella of all sorts of things. This is the definition given by Every Child Matters, which is one of the frameworks that came out of some legislation that the government developed. Very much, abuse and child welfare, as we saw in our last lecture, it's everybody's responsibility. Everyone has a part to play. And when you're someone who's working really closely, often with some very vulnerable children, I have to say, support workers, this is really where you shine, because you're going to be the people who, when you know what you're looking for, are going to be able to make a real difference. Okay, so let's look at slide 3, types of abuse. Previously, when I taught this course, there were 4 sorts of abuse, but now we have 9, I believe. We're going to go through them all, so that the headlines are physical abuse, sexual, emotional, neglect, radicalisation, FGM, female genital mutilation, grooming, fabricated and induced illness. That's an interesting one. We'll talk about them in turn. Okay, slide 4, physical abuse. This is really the easiest sorts of things to spot when a child is being hurt. You could see things like bruises, bite marks, cigarette burns. Children can be shaken. All sorts of things obviously can happen. Sometimes if you are dealing with a child that's experienced long-term physical abuse, the places where they might have marks can be quite hidden places. So you might notice changing nappies, cigarette burns in the sort of inner leg area. If they're doing sports, you might see something on backs, belt marks, buckle marks, that kind of stuff, things which aren't really obvious. If you look at your next slide, what to look out for. Excessive bruising, we all know that some children seem to bruise more than others. Some children are constantly, covered in bruises, and you have your tree climbers. It's you get to know the children quite well, and it's the other sort of behavioural things which could really indicate there could be a problem. Things like flinching away from other children or from adults. And don't forget, abuse isn't always experienced in the home from parents. It can be from other siblings, other people in the household too. Reluctance to change for PE, a reluctance to take long sleeves off when it's really, really hot, being withdrawn, being aggressive, being very scared if there's a problem at school and you want to contact home, want to speak to parents, that can cause a big flare up of behaviour. That's an indication. Truancy, so running away from school, running away from home, all of these things. Okay, sexual abuse. So this is slide 6. So when a child is forced or persuaded into sexual activities or situations, so it can be, physical sexual abuse, or it can be non-physical, things like looking at pornographic material with adults, being involved in sexual acts. There's a picture I've put on the PowerPoint of one of those beauty pageant children. I don't know if you've seen them. It's a really big deal in America where they have these children, little 5, 6, 7-year-old girls with all the hair and the nails, dressing up in very sort of provocative clothing, and they have like a swimsuit round and a evening wear round. It sends off some very confusing signals. I think in our society as well, we have all the celebrity culture and girls aspiring to be like people they see in videos and in games. Again, not always very good role models for little girls. Some of the clothes you can buy, kind of tiny little pants and crop tops for very young children. You think it's very confusing. It's confusing for the children. It's confusing for other adults, and I'm sure we all know people from our own experiences, like young teenage girls who, when they're all dressed up, could pass for like 25. Children can find themselves in some very difficult situations. Slide 7, what to look for. So for a child that is experiencing some kind of sexual abuse, sexualized behavior, so behaving in a way that's not appropriate with their age, using words, noises that you wouldn't think that they would be familiar with, children being easily upset or very, very quiet, socially isolating themselves. Often when children have lost control over an aspect of themselves, you can see this will affect the way that they have control of the things they can manage. So often things like eating disorders, sort of binge eating or starving themselves, that kind of thing can be quite common. Love bites, in some cases pregnancy, and then there's the 2 phones. Any child who's got 2 phones, it's an alarm call. You could suggest a lot of children don't need 1 phone. If you've got 2 phones, it can mean a variety of things. The other thing is, for children in this kind of situation, if they're very anxious about people seeing what's on their phone or getting near their phone, that can be a real indication. Basically, if you've got 2 phones, you've got a phone that your family have given you so they know that where you are when the bus breaks down. Who's that other phone from? Is that someone having a special relationship? What other adults are involved? Is it drugs? Is it a county lines thing? No matter what the situation, 2 phones are always a cause for concern in my mind. And this is still part of sexual abuse. There's a thing about teenage sexual exploitation, which you may or may not be aware of. Controlling relationships where partners are coerced into sexual relationships for a variety of reasons. There's been some interesting sort of adverts on the telly, actually probably a couple of years ago now, about this. Being very controlled, and I think for now we have phones where you have trackers on, this kind of stuff. There can be a real confusion about what's jealousy and a healthy relationship, and what's really sort of controlling and damaging. Certainly for vulnerable girls, I've worked with a few who have suddenly had lovely clothes and nice phones and new weaves, lots of money being spent on them, and they suddenly have like this kind of older, slightly flash boyfriend, and that's another one you think, this looks like this could be one to watch. Okay, so moving on to emotional abuse. So this is when a child suffers persistent ill treatment, which affects their emotional development. It may mean making the child feel very worthless and very frightened. You know, if a child is constantly told that they are stupid or lazy or not worth the effort, you know, this has a really really difficult effect on them, you know, long term, lifelong, in terms of their self-esteem and their confidence, the way that they view themselves and the way that they view other people as well. So what would you look out for here? You know, if nobody's on your side, you'd be expecting you might see children with developmental delays, speech delays, often self-harming can be a manifestation of those very, you know, low feelings of self-worth. They can be very emotional. They can find it very difficult to make friends and form relationships. It's very difficult to believe that people could be interested in them if nobody at home is interested in them. And so you can see, you know, the sorts of relationships that we have when we're supporting these children, you know, they absolutely can be transformational in terms of having that sort of steady pair of eyes, that someone who's always pleased to see you in the morning when you come into school, who always wants to know how you are. You know, it's small things, but for some of these kids, it honestly, it's an absolute game changer. Okay, let's have a look at neglect. And there's a picture you'll see on the PowerPoint of brain scans of the 3-year-old children, and we have a normal brain scan on the left-hand side, which is probably twice as large as the child that's experienced extreme neglect. And I'm sure you've been aware of some of the studies that have been made of children. The Romanian orphans situation springs to mind, where children were fed and kept warm and sheltered, but they weren't given any emotional stimulus at all. And, you know, your brain just does not develop in a way that, you know, it doesn't make those pathways which will lead to you fulfilling your potential. It shuts things down. You know, for small children, you know, if they're not having that familiar voice, if they're not experiencing warmth and emotional connection, you know, they don't thrive emotionally. Parts of the brain just don't grow properly. So, you know, it's a massive problem. When we think about neglecting children, we think about depriving them of, you know, things like shelter and food and education, that kind of stuff. It's the emotional input that's really, really important. Okay, slide 12 is female genital mutilation. Depending on where you work, this can be a more or less of a problem. It's a practice in some communities in Africa, Middle East and Asia. Depending on the cohort in your school, you know, you might have lots of children from those areas. It's carried out for cultural and religious reasons, and what it is, it's like a surgical operation where part of the external female genitalia are removed. Lots of reasons behind it. You know, for women not to experience sexual pleasure can be seen as a real bonus in terms of being very loyal to husbands. It causes all sorts of problems in terms of infection. Children and women, you know, when they turn into women, sort of later having trouble giving birth because of the scar tissue. You know, it's a pretty brutal thing. It is illegal, but it's still practiced. If you want to look out for, so it usually happens to girls on sort of at the start of puberty. If you hear that a big long holiday is being planned over the summer holiday, that might be something to look out for. You might see children who it's happened to suddenly, you know, a real big behavioural change, very clingy, not wanting to join in physical activities. You know, it's extremely painful, and because it's not done in a situation with proper medication and the things that you would expect in the hospital, you know, the risk of infection is really huge. So that's certainly a problem. Really, yeah. Okay, grooming, yay. So slide 14. So grooming, I think, you know, probably everyone's very well aware of grooming, particularly looking at the e-safety work we've already done. But basically, where you have adults that are building relationships with children with a view to abusing them at a later stage. I mean, these relationships can last a really long time. You know, people can throw a lot of energy into building these relationships of trust. Grooming can happen online, but it can also happen in person. Um, Things you want to watch out for: special presents, special holidays, special phones, again, all warning signs. Adults that are paying particular attention to certain children. Um, yeah, lots of these things. Lots of these things start when you're noticing things, you know, with just a kind of a feeling that something isn't quite right, and that's when you have to start, you know, really looking, really observing what's going on. And this can be very difficult because you can find yourself, you know, it's easy enough to think, oh well, I'll be at school and there'll be these children that I don't know, and they'll, you know, but actually sometimes you will start to think about what's happening in your own life and the people that you know, and start to see things with a different eye. Once you really are on the wavelength of looking for signs of abuse, you know, it doesn't it's not like a 9 to 5 thing that you turn off and you turn on. You know, abuse is really common in all its different forms, and you always have to really keep an open mind. And just because it might be somebody you know or someone in your family, you know, it doesn't mean that it isn't happening. It's yeah, it's a difficult one. Okay, slide 15. Fabricated and induced illness, FII, also known as Munchausen's syndrome by proxy. And this is an unusual, I say unusual, I don't know how unusual it is actually. I haven't come across it myself. But it's a rare form of abuse where a parent will make up symptoms to get attention. And often this will be the result of the child receiving some attention, maybe being in hospital, maybe their family will have been really supported. I hate to say it's usually the mother that's at the centre of it. You know, we'll have a lot of attention, we'll have a lot of people being very interested in helping out maybe other children, helping out with the house, just feeling really, really needed. And sometimes, you know, they find when the child recovers, they find it very difficult to just go back to things being as they were before. And this is where the fabricated illness comes into. So sometimes parents will give their children medication that they don't need to make them ill. They can give them things which will slightly poison them. All sorts of practices can happen which will, you know, bring them to the attention of doctors. And, you know, they are well aware of when to start to investigate and looking at all the symptoms, which is, you know, which again is why it's so useful that different groups of people can sort of communicate with each other. Because if you have a family, you know, in this situation, they're going to be known to other areas as well. So yes, that's quite an interesting one. Moving on, we've got radicalisation. So where children and young people are encouraged into a group with extreme political, religious or social aims. And the signs for this would be things like being online a lot, being secretive, being argumentative, expressing sympathy for extremist views. And if any of you have teenage children yourself, that is the description of a teenager, so it's quite difficult to see. For lots of young people, you know, things are very black and white, and they're very keen to, you know, to have a lot of passion for things. So it's a difficult one. You might notice, you know, change in style, symbols appearing on books or phones, or like tattoos. You know, you need to be pretty watchful. But as I say, it's quite difficult to distinguish from teenage behaviour. Radicalisation is part of the annual training that you have in schools. There's a thing called the Prevent Duty, which is actually on the next slide as well, where schools train staff to be really mindful of the signs of radicalisation. Different areas have different approaches depending on the perceived risk, and there's under the Prevent Duty, Eastleigh where I work, there's been a bit of a rise of anti-Semitism lately, and so we've had a bit of talk about that. There's also been quite a lot of far right action going on, so we've had to talk about that, what to look out for. So it depending on where you are, the risk of from different groups will change. Okay, 18, bullying. So bullying, which is as old as time. We've got now lots of different sorts of forms of bullying here. So we've got the verbal bullying, which is the name calling and the teasing, which we're all familiar with. Social bullying, picking on people and encouraging other people to join in, so sort of working as a group, that's particularly nasty. Physical bullying, we've got that's obviously the violence that we remember from school days. Cyberbullying, obviously everything that happens online. Prejudicial bullying, which is going to be targeted on one of the 9 protected characteristics: religion, race, disability, that sort of thing. And we've got gangs bullying, which is like social bullying, but a whole group will target an individual. Lovely. So many different forms of child abuse that can be experienced out there. And how common is it? If you have a look at slide 19, according to the NSPCC, which is the National Society of the Protection of Cruelty from Children, 1 in 10 children have suffered from neglect. That's the most common form of abuse that's reported to Children's Services. 1 in 20 children have suffered from sexual abuse. Children with disabilities are the most vulnerable. I mean, it absolutely spikes up. Children with disabilities, are extremely vulnerable, and special care has got to be taken in terms of the vetting the people that work with them, and really ensuring that they are safe. Bit of an old statistic for you on slide 20 from 2015, but it says that 49,000 children in the UK were identified as needing protection from abuse. That's a lot of children. And they go on to say that they estimate that for every child identified as needing protection, another 8 must be suffering from abuse. It's a really big problem. And who can it happen to? People might have ideas about who's going to be the most likely person, but actually it can happen in any area, any community, any family, any social group, any economic group. It can happen to anybody. What I would like you to do now, I've written on the last slide, there's a YouTube link, which is the NSPCC Teaching Children in Primary Schools. So go to the link. It's about, they have a thing called Safe Pants, something to do with pants safety. Anyway, it's really interesting, and it's talks to children about for primary school children about what's theirs is theirs, and in a really sort of gentle way. There's lots of discussion about young children being made aware of abuse, and obviously a lot of parents want to protect them from the fact that that even happens, but because we know it happens, it can only be the responsible thing to make children sort of aware of what's right and what's wrong. Often when you speak to adults who've experienced abuse as children, they were not always aware that that wasn't something that happened to everybody. So as terrible as it is, it's quite a useful thing to watch. Okay, all right, I shall speak to you later.